Hey everyone, my name is Dylan Adams, and for today's video, we're going to be talking about amp modelers, and specifically we're going to be talking about this one. This is the new Universal Audio Lion 68 Super Lead amp. In today's video, I'm going to play this for you guys and demonstrate its usefulness as a recording tool, but I also want to do a sort of experiment. I want to see if this thing is a worthy replacement for my real tube amps in a live gigging situation. If you know me, then you'll know that I'm kind of a snob and a purist when it comes to amps. My ideal rig is to just plug straight into a good tube amp, crank it up, and control everything from the guitar, no pedals on the floor. For that reason, this thing kind of has its work cut out for it. So let's get into it. So for those of you who don't know, Universal Audio has a line of digital amp simulator pedals that each emulate the sound of an iconic classic guitar amp from the 50s or 60s. They initially came out with 3 of them last year, and those are the Dream, which is a 1965 Fender Deluxe Reverb, the Woodrow, which is a 1955 Fender Tweed Deluxe amp, and the Ruby, which is an early 60s Vox AC30 amp. And now they have released the Lion, which is a 68 Marshall Plexi simulator. Full disclosure, Universal Audio sent me this. I did not pay for it, but I'm the one that reached out to them about doing this because I was so excited to hear that they released a Plexi version. And I've been a huge fan of Universal Audio for a long time, long before I ever started to form a relationship with them. I've bought many of their products, including the Apollo Twin interface, which is what I'm recording through right now. I bought the Dream pedal at full price when it came out last year. I bought their 55 Tweed Deluxe plugin and a couple other plugins from them, and I use their stuff all the time. Over the past few years, my taste in guitar tone when it comes to my sound has gradually shifted from a kind of Fender blackface 60s kind of thing over to a Fender Tweed kind of thing, and now I've kind of shifted more into a 60s Marshall Plexi JTM 45 kind of thing for what I prefer. So this was kind of perfect timing, and I was extremely excited to see that this came out. They didn't ask me to make this video. They didn't ask me to say nice things about their stuff on the internet. I'm purely doing this because I'm really excited about this pedal and its potential for gigging and recording with. Now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and hear some tones from this thing. All right, let's go through my setup for this portion of the video. So this is the guitar I'm using. I figured I would use this guitar because, I mean, what is a more iconic combo than Gibson Les Paul into a Plexi? So I'm just running my cord here straight into the main input on the Lion pedal. And from the main output of the pedal, I just have a patch cable running to the guitar input on the front of my Apollo interface. And the interface is just recording straight into Logic Pro on my MacBook with a little bit of reverb added in post, and that's it. Aside from the reverb being added, there is no other coloration going on whatsoever. The entirety of the tone that you're hearing is coming from the pedal. This thing is both an amp modeler and a speaker emulator all in one, just like the rest of the UAFX amp modeler pedals. So this isn't like a Marshall in a box overdrive pedal. This is an amp in a pedal. So I'm not going to go over every single feature of this pedal in this video. There are other demo videos out there that will show you everything that this pedal can do. I'm mainly just going to show you how I like to use this pedal now that I've spent quite a bit of time messing with it at home and have found the settings that I like the most. So looking at the knobs on this pedal, you can see we have volume 1, volume 2, output, bass, middle, treble, and then a few alternate settings you can adjust with this alt switch right here. So if you're confused, you can look at it this way. Essentially, all of the controls except for the output and the room control when you're in alt mode, all of the rest of the controls are acting like they would on an actual Marshall Plexi amp. So you can imagine this volume 1, volume 2, bass, middle, treble, and then your presence. those are going to be interacting in the exact same way that they would on an actual Marshall Plexi head. And then the output control just adjusts the overall volume that's coming out of the output of the pedal. So it's not changing any tone or overdrive or anything like that. It's purely just adjusting the volume of the signal that's coming out of the pedal. So something that's awesome about this pedal in particular, and I think the Ruby as well, but especially this one, is that this third switch right here adjusts the specific model of Marshall Plexi that you're playing through. And the model that I prefer on this pedal is the super bass setting. It just is a little bit softer. It doesn't have quite that aggressive upper mid-range thing going on. It's a little more leaning towards that earlier JTM 45 squishy, saggy kind of thing, which I tend to prefer. And then lastly, you have 3 speaker emulations to choose from. If you register your pedal on the app, then you'll get 3 more, but in stock form, it's going to have the GB25, which is a 25 watt Celestion G12M greenback, the GB30, which is a 30 watt Celestion G12H greenback, and then finally your JB/GB selection is going to be a simulation of a 412 cabinet with 2 JBL D120F speakers and 2 Celestion greenbacks. I believe 25 watt. And so far that JB/GB setting has been my favorite. The greenback one maybe sounds a little bit dark to me. At least on the super bass setting. The GB30 setting is a little bit brighter, but it kind of has a funny upper mid-range thing going on to me, and it still sounds a little bit like distant, if that makes sense. So but the JB/GB setting sounds perfect to me. It kind of has that presence and immediacy, but it's not too harsh sounding, and it just is the most kind of balanced sounding one to me. So that sounds pretty amazing to me. I've gotten to play a few real vintage Plexis, and this thing totally has the sound. So these are the settings that I've found that I like the most with it. I like to have the volumes not cranked all the way. You hear a lot of times people just like to dime Plexis, but for me, it just sounds a little bit over the top like that. So here it is with both volumes cranked all the way. And it doesn't sound bad, but it's just a little bit blown out sounding to me. If you just roll those volume knobs back a little bit, then it still has pretty much the same amount of gain, but it just is tighter and just better sounding to me. And for bass, middle, treble, I have the bass turned down fairly low. I don't like to turn it up too high past halfway. It tends to flub out and just kind of sound bloated and just not very nice to me if the bass is too high. That goes for most tube amps, honestly. Especially if you're cranking it, you got to keep the bass pretty low, like lower than you would expect. Mids cranked all the way up, I feel like it gives it the best kind of saturation and fullness and just punch. Treble turned up a decent amount, but not all the way. Particularly with this speaker setting, it's a little bit on the brighter side, so I don't want to crank it all the way up, but just enough to where it sounds nice and clear. Then once we go to the alternate setting, I have the room turned up a little bit, probably about the same level as the bass is at, so it's a pretty subtle amount, but just enough to give it some life so it doesn't sound too dry. The presence I have about halfway to, maybe a little smidge above halfway. The boost I just have turned off. I think it's supposed to be like if you're running an Echoplex into the front of it like Jimmy Page did. But it sounds cool, but I prefer to just leave it off. So I haven't mentioned yet one of my absolute favorite things about this pedal, maybe the best thing about it to me, and that is how well it reacts to dynamics in your right hand and the volume knob on your guitar. So all the playing examples I've done so far are with the volume knob on 10 on the guitar, but listen to what happens when you just roll it back to around 6 or 7. You ready? It cleans up amazingly, and it reacts just like a cranked higher wattage tube amp. That is extremely exciting and something that's really important for me because, like I said, my preferred setup is just going straight into the front of an amp, cranking it, and then controlling everything from the guitar. So I'm not stepping on pedals to get my gain stages or anything like that. It's all purely just... right? And then just right-hand dynamics as well. So here it is with the volume on 10 and just picking a little bit softer. And that is what I think Universal Audio nails more than any other company when it comes to amp modelers, is that touch sensitivity and kind of tactile feel, the sort of sag and squishiness that a real tube amp has when you crank it up, as well as the kind of speaker breakup and sizzle that a real tube amp has. That's something that I think people miss when they haven't had the chance to crank a tube amp before and spend some time with it and get familiar with how it sounds. People's overdrive tone, a lot of the time, if they only have been accustomed to pedals, is very dark and smooth sounding, which, you know, it can be a good thing and it can be a sound, but it's not what a real cranked amp sounds like the majority of the time, unless you just run the treble way down or something. A real tube amp cranked up, pushing a real speaker, has a certain just kind of sizzle to it and a certain presence and brightness that, you know, if it's a good amp and a good speaker, it's not harsh, but it's something that a lot of modelers kind of miss. And that's the thing that I like the most about this pedal, is just those kind of subtle little details in the sound and the feel of it that are just more authentic to a real tube amp than any other emulations that I've ever played. And that goes for the rest of the Universal Audio amp emulations as well. And to have a tone that is that accurate to a real vintage tube amp in a small pedal form that can be played completely silently is huge, and it is extremely valuable for anyone who wants an extremely accurate Plexi amp experience at home. But what about gigging? So DI rigs have become really popular in the last few years with the Helix and, again, the Fractal and Quad Cortex and things like that. And people typically run them with in-ear monitors, and they're becoming especially popular for any situation where 0 stage volume is required. But what I really want to find out is whether this pedal, and by extension other high-quality amp modelers, can stand up to playing on a stage with high stage volume with a band that has a loud drummer, real guitar amps alongside this virtual amp. And it just so happens that the band that I play in, Smokestack, is a loud band. We have high stage volume. I almost always crank my amps. My bandmate Jack has vintage super reverbs and Varbaluxes and turns them up. I want to see if this thing can hold up in a situation like that. So I'm going to take you guys along with me to tonight's gig, and I'm going to bring this pedal, and I'm going to try to go all night just using the Universal Audio Lion as my main amp for the whole gig. So let's see how it goes. Hey guys, so I'm here at the gig, and real quick, I just wanted to kind of show you how I have this set up. And first, let me show you what my setup would normally be with a real amp. So I brought a real amp with me as a backup, just in case the Lion pedal didn't work out for playing live. And so this is the PRS HDRX20. This has kind of become one of my main go-to amps. So essentially my normal setup would be just plugging straight into that amp with just a Strymon Flint reverb pedal sitting on top. Put a mic in front of the cabinet. That goes to our PA system, of course. And to my monitor wedge that's sitting in front of me. But essentially what I've done is, now my guitar is going into the same pedal that I normally do. And then instead of an amp, this pedal is going into the Lion, and that's going into this DI box. And my mic line that would normally go to my mic is now going to this DI box. So that's what's being fed to the PA. That's what I'm hearing from my monitor, and that's what's coming out of the mains. And Jack's rig, the other guitarist in the band, is a 66 Super Reverb with just a good old pedal board, a couple drive pedals, boost, stuff like that. So he's got a very traditional kind of rig set up here. All right, ready? Hey guys, so it's been a couple days since the gig, and here are my thoughts on the Lion amp modeler pedal now that I've used it live. First of all, the tone of it is undeniably fantastic. I was totally happy with what I was hearing on stage. All of my bandmates said that it sounded great in their monitor mixes. Our sound guy, who also happens to be an amp tech, said that it cut through amazingly out front, that it sounded like a real amp. It sounded just like a Plexi. One thing I did notice is that it sounded quite a bit brighter on stage than it does through my interface with headphones. So much so that I ended up using the GB25 speaker setting, which if you remember from earlier in the video, I said sounded kind of dark to me with headphones, but it actually ended up sounding perfect on stage. And the JB/GB setting sounded a little bit harsh on stage compared to with headphones. That could be due to the fact that there's a tweeter in the monitor that I was using, or just my monitor mix could have had a little bit of EQ on it, making it a little bit brighter, but that is one thing to consider. So the tone was great, but more importantly, did it feel like a real amplifier on stage? And I would say yes and no. It still reacted to my right-hand dynamics and my guitar's volume control exactly the same way as it did at home. And the actual overall volume change of it that went along with my dynamics and rolling back the guitar volume felt pretty realistic. The volume didn't drop out drastically when I rolled back my volume knob, and it wasn't excessively loud. It kind of reacted the same way a real amp would in that sense. And I tried to get that across in the clips that I showed. But despite that, there is an inherent difference between a guitar speaker and a monitor speaker. It's kind of hard to put into words, but there was something about it that just didn't quite feel the same as a real amp. Part of that, of course, is due to the fact that it's coming at you from in front rather than from behind like a real amp would. But that aspect isn't so much a part of it for me because I'm used to always having my guitar signal come back at me from the monitor. But the difference there is that it's only coming from that one source rather than from the monitor and from behind from the actual speaker cabinet. I imagine it's what it would feel like if you had, say, a real Marshall Plexi off to the side of the stage in an ISO box and then mic'd it, and then having that signal come back at you from the monitor. The tone itself and the feel coming from the amp is realistic and spot on and sounds great, but just the very fact that it's coming out of a monitor in front of you is just different. That said, it wasn't different enough for me to dislike it, and overall I was happy with how it performed. And as you saw, I ended up using it for the entire night. I didn't really feel the need to switch amps, or I didn't have the, kind of urge to be like, I kind of want to go back to my real amp. It still was perfectly fine for me for the whole night. So let's go through some pros and cons. Some pros would be that it's obviously extremely small and lightweight and reliable as opposed to a gigantic, heavy, fragile tube amp, especially a vintage Marshall Plexi. The amp modeler pedal itself inherently has no stage volume. Of course, the way I was running it with the monitor wedge in front of me kind of created some stage volume, but if you have an in-ear monitor system, then it's going to be a completely silent way to get your sound. And a huge pro with this pedal in particular and the rest of the UAFX amp modeler pedals is that the tone is absolutely incredible, and I would even go so far as to say it's indistinguishable from the real thing, at least a recorded tone of it. If you mic'd up a real Marshall Plexi of the same era and mic'd it up the same way as they did when they modeled these amps, recorded it, and then compared it to this pedal, I think it would be pretty much indistinguishable. So the quality and the realism of the tone you're getting from this is absolutely spot on. So in that sense, with this pedal in particular, it's kind of like you're buying a vintage Marshall Super Lead, a vintage Marshall Super Bass, a Variac, multiple different speaker cabinets for $400, which is obviously drastically cheaper than the real thing. Cons of this modeler in particular would be, of course, everyone's talked about that this doesn't have as many features and doesn't feature as many amps as some other modelers out there. Like a Kemper, you can get hundreds of different amps all in one thing. For me personally, I don't really care that much about that because I think this sounds better than most, if not all, other modelers out there. And as someone who loves vintage amps and all of the nuances that they bring, I would rather have 2 or 3 extremely realistic, accurate, amazing sounding amp options than hundreds or thousands of less realistic, just okay or just good amp options. I will say, though, I think it is a big miss on Universal Audio's part that they didn't include a headphone jack with this and the other UAFX pedals. The fact that you have to have an audio interface or some sort of powered monitoring system to run this thing does bring down the practicality of it for home practice. That's not a deal breaker for me personally, but that would have been a really nice feature with these pedals. Cons of amp modelers in general, not just this one, particularly for live use, would be your PA system and your monitoring system have to be spot on for this to work. If there's any kind of weak link anywhere that's going to prevent you from hearing yourself or prevent you from sounding good out front, you're kind of out of luck. In Smokestack, we're lucky to have our own great PA system that we bring with us to most gigs. Or really, our bass player, Brian, owns it and lugs it around to every one of our gigs. So thanks, Brian. If your band doesn't have a PA or has a very basic PA and you don't typically mic your guitar amps, then you could run into some issues there. Or if you find yourself in a more spontaneous kind of jam situation or rehearsal where you don't necessarily have a PA and a monitoring system that you could plug this into, then it's not going to work. So while it is lightweight and portable, it doesn't quite have the same kind of grab and go ability as, say, a small tube amp. And lastly, it just doesn't feel exactly the same as a real amp, at least if you're using a monitor wedge or in-ear monitor. Just the nature of it, even if the tone of it is absolutely perfect, the feel of it, it just isn't the same thing as having a real guitar cabinet behind you. I am interested to try this with some sort of powered full range guitar cabinet. That may be a follow-up video that I do sometime in the future where I plug the Lion into a powered guitar specific cabinet and have it behind me and see how that performs. So, final thoughts. Are amp modelers viable for gigging? I would say yes, absolutely. Clearly, tons of people are happily using them on stage. It actually just came out recently that the Edge of U2 switched from using real amps to using these universal audio modelers. So I think that says it all in terms of its viability. Did the Lion pedal keep up with the loud blues rock band that I play in? I would say yes. You can hear it in the clips. I could hear myself just fine on stage. It was cutting through great up front. So this thing can live alongside real amps. But as I said, your PA and your monitoring system has to be spot on for it to work right. And lastly, will it replace my real tube amps? I'm going to say no. Nothing will ever fully replace a real great tube amp for me. There's just something to be said about the visceral experience of playing through a real amp on stage, about playing through real analog equipment. And like I said before, there are just certain situations where a real amp is just more practical. But this pedal is something that I will absolutely use in certain live settings, particularly ones where I need low or no stage volume. It will probably come with me to every gig from here on out as a backup for my real amps. And I'm absolutely going to use this thing extensively for recording. I pretty much haven't touched anything else since I got this thing when it comes to recording at home. Overall, I think the Lion is a fantastic piece of gear, and Universal Audio totally knocked it out of the park with this thing. So that does it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you could please like and comment on this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the bell notification icon to get notified whenever I post new videos. That will help out my channel a lot. Don't forget that I offer private lessons. The link to sign up for those is in the description of this video. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, take it easy.